Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and a really warm welcome to this, our Sunday afternoon Solas webinar. We're going to be here for the next hour, and we're going to be talking about the great subject of hope. Hope is, of course, one of the things which we search for as humans. It seems to be wired deeply into us to need hope. In fact, it was Dostoevsky who said to lose hope is to cease to live. Hope is something we all search for, something we all look for. The full title this afternoon, Finding Hope in a World of Uncertainty, where we find ourselves at the moment. And of course, hope comes in all kinds of shapes and forms. Some of the things we hope for are trivial. Some of them are of massive significance. My oldest son was hoping by this stage in 2020 to have watched Liverpool winning the English Premiership and to see St Johnstone staying up in the Scottish Premier League. And as the ancient Jewish proverb says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. On the other hand, there are some things which we hope for which are of much deeper, sort of life-changing significance. We all intrinsically hope for longevity and prosperity. And the pandemic that we've seen sweeping through the world in the last few months has certainly challenged our assumptions of longevity, and what the economic forecast suggests is a severe threat to our prosperity as well. So where can hope be found in a world like this? Well, joining me to discuss these things this afternoon, as ever, we've got Andy Bannister, who is in Dundee, who's the director of Solas, and zooming in from across the Irish Sea, Gareth Black is joining us again this afternoon.
Great
Welcome,
to be
guys.
with you, Gavin.
Good to see you. Now, as well as these two guys joining, we would love your contributions as well. Now, I know several people have come back to the Solas webinars time and time again, so forgive me for repeating the announcement. But for those of you who are new, who have not been on one of our webinars before, you can join in. What we'd love you to do is to join in and help us steer the second half of the conversation this afternoon. Gareth and Andy are going to set the conversation off with some thoughts. I'll ask them some questions first up, but we'd love your questions too. And they can have a really helpful input. In fact, our previous webinars just wouldn't have been good without the questions that came in from folks watching at home. So please join in. And the way to do that is to open your web browser and go to pigeonhole.at. If you open pigeonhole.at, you can see the link coming up there on the screen now. And when the box comes up, you can type in Solas 14 June, and that will open up the chat just for this webinar. If you put a question in there, then that will be answered in the second half of this hour's webinar. Of course, if you see a question in there, you think that's a great question, instead of repeating it, you can vote for it. That's one of the really good little things that we like about Pigeonhole. You can vote for which you think are the most profound questions. That brings them to the top of the list, and they are the ones that are most likely to be seen. So please join in the discussion. I'll put that link up there again during the next few minutes. So if you missed it then, it will come up again. So think up some questions and help steer our discussion. So Gareth, I'd like to kick off with you this afternoon, if we can. I think what we should do maybe is to start off by, I suppose, kind of taking stock just for a little bit about kind of where we are at the moment with things, and to maybe ask you, well, in terms of things that people normally look to for hope, for security, for meaning, how has the coronavirus pandemic affected those things at the moment? Gareth.
Thanks, Gavin, and hello to everybody watching online. It's great to be with you. I think it's a great question, and I'm looking forward to unpacking it. Let me maybe just begin our discussion by mentioning a few things. I think you summarized it quite well, Gavin, when you give your little synopsis of the webinar. I think one of the basic things that has been destabilized by the coronavirus pandemic is this hope that a lot of us look to in terms of our health and our well-being, kind of at that base level. I mean, many people say and have said to me in the past, as long as you have your health, then, that's ultimately all that you need. And of course, when there's a deadly pathogenic virus sweeping indiscriminately across the world, and we're not exactly sure how it works. We can identify that it does affect certain demographics in certain ways, but we're not exactly sure why. It really increases our sense of vulnerability at the physical level. And of course, we've all been devastated by the numbers of people that have been both whose lives have been taken by this, but also those who've been affected long term by it in terms of their recovery. And that's just the physical side. There's also the mental health side of things. And I think we're going to see over the next few years that there is a very long tail to this curve that this virus has, both in terms of the physical challenges, but certainly in terms of the mental health challenges for those who've been isolated, and also those who've perhaps been on the front line and really been facing this, and in some ways just getting through it without having to process it properly because they just haven't had the space. A couple of other things that I think we need to consider as well is as you've mentioned, the economic factors. You know, there's been this virus came very quickly, but it's not going to go very quickly. There's no quick fix, and so in that sense, we're going to need to learn to live in a coronavirus world. And that's going to have huge economic challenges for how we do business. I'm thinking of people in the hospitality sector. We've recently here in Northern Ireland heard some really difficult news of people who are involved in the aeronautics industry, and a lot of people who work in companies in that sector here have been laid off this week. It's going to have huge tolls on our professional life, our career ambitions, thinking even of students and what way universities are going to work and when they're going to get into business opportunities and things like that. And so we're often told to sort of place our hope in economic factors, and our life is kind of the sum of the things that we can accumulate materially. And of course, coronavirus and the way that we've had to respond to it has undermined those things. Added to that then is this social dimension. We've talked or we've heard a lot about statutes on our news, and I'm not going to go into that too deeply. You'll be glad to know. But it's interesting when I think of statues, they kind of are literally monuments to the sort of independent achiever. And we like this idea of, you know, we're independent beings, we can self-actualize, you know, we in a sense are able to create and sustain and make prosperous our own lives by our own efforts. And of course, I think one of the things that coronavirus has revealed is that we're actually social beings, and we're we are dependent. We are dependent on each other for all kinds of deep existential needs in relation to meaning and value and our identity and things like that. And of course, pixels and AirPods are just a poor substitute for that. I think we're all fatigued of connecting via screens. And the final thing that I'd just say in relation to that is one thing that I think coronavirus has destabilized more than anything is the myth sometimes that we live in a world that is ultimately stable. I think we, you know, there were ideas that sort of emerged with the modernity movement that kind of suggested that if, you know, we'll ultimately be making progress, life is predictable, we can calculate where things are going, and therefore we can engineer things to make our lives secure and prosperous. And of course, you know, any sort of things that come along like coronavirus or anything that makes our lives ultimately vulnerable are often just seen as turbulence on an otherwise stable flight to where we're going. But the reality is that that's not the case. I think coronavirus hasn't really revealed anything new in terms of how unstable life is. In reality, it's just put in high definition things that we often don't like to think too deeply about. It's pulled the roof off how vulnerable our lives can be, and also caused us to see that actually these deep existential questions of meaning and value and significance are something that are intrinsic to our humanity and we all need to think about. So it's not necessarily raised new problems as much as brought into high definition the problems that are often there.
I think that's right. It's certainly focused the mind, hasn't it, the current sort of situation. Thanks for that, Gareth. I think that's given us a useful starting point in terms of a snapshot of where we're starting the discussion. Andy, I wonder if you could take us deeper then and maybe probe into the areas. Why do we look for hope? Why, as human beings, do we seem to be wired to look for hope? Why are we not content just to shrug our shoulders and say, well, whatever? Why is there something within us that searches in a deep way for hope? And why does that matter so much to us? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you for that question, Gavin and Gareth. Thank you for kicking us off so well. You know, the interesting thing is, in one sense, the fact that we're wired to look for hope. I think Gavin is patently self-evident, right? We are hope-seeking creatures. There is something unique about human beings among the animal kingdom, in that we are not content just to live with the needs we have for survival. You know, most creatures on the planet, provided you give them, you know, food and shelter and a mate so they can pass on their genes and their DNA to the next generation, they're fine. Life is great. You know, squirrels and cats and so forth and other animals don't sit around sort of contemplating the deeper questions of life. But human beings, well, that's clearly not the case. Clearly we need more than just those things. We seem to be wired to be creatures who need things like meaning, like purpose, like significance, and like hope. And it's interesting, actually, there was a study done back in, I think it was the 1980s from memory, by a psychologist who looked at people who had been through the Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War, and were particularly interested in resilience. What was it that caused some people, who'd survived the camps to then do well when they were released and liberated, and what caused others to actually, even though they'd been freed by the Allies, to their lives ended in despair and misery. And he wrote a fascinating book called the Faith and Doubt of Holocaust Survivors, and really showed that people who have a hope in something bigger did so much better. It wasn't just enough to survive. It wasn't just enough to be liberated. People needed something bigger, especially actually when trying to process the suffering that they'd been through. And in fact, another very famous Holocaust and concentration camp survivor was the Jewish psychologist Viktor Frankl, who wrote a best-selling book called Man's Search for Meaning. Sold millions upon millions of copies. And towards the end of that book, he writes these words. He says, "For too long, we have been dreaming a dream from which we are only now just waking up. The dream that if we just improve the socio-economic situation of people, that everything will be okay. People will become happy. But the truth is that as the struggle for survival has subsided, this question has emerged. Survival for what? Ever more people today have the means to live, but no meaning to live for." I love those last words there. Ever more people have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. So therefore, the question becomes, what do we do with this? And really, I think I see two choices as we look at the fact we are wired to be hope-seeking creatures. We need to find hope and meaning and purpose. There's only really two scenarios. Well, number one, evolution has played a cruel trick on us. We are nothing more than the product of time plus chance plus natural selection. We live in a purely materialistic world, and these impulses and desires we have are meaningless. Life is literally absurd. Or the other possibility is that our need and our desire for meaning and purpose and hope show that these things are to be found. And a very famous analogy, if you're lost wandering deep in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Arabian Empty Quarter, one of the most vast and trackless deserts in the world, and you desperately crave water, the fact that you have that terrible thirst proves to you that water exists, because there's no other explanation for why you have that desire for something other than there's something to meet it. Now, that doesn't prove that every glimmer on the horizon is necessarily an oasis. There are such things as mirages. But the very fact you have this need and this desire is a pointer that you were created to have that need and desire satisfied somewhere. And I would say, just as it is for water, it's the same when it comes to things like meaning, significance, purpose, and hope.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Andy. That's really helpful. Gareth, I want to bring you back in now. I want to ask you where we go with what Andy's just said, because Andy's explained, using Viktor Frankl and other people, why we need hope and how we are wired to need a hope to live for. But that, I suppose, presupposes that there is a meaning in the universe, there is a purpose in the universe, and that everything we observe, everything we live, isn't just completely absurd. Because if the universe is fundamentally just absurd, then the search for hope is really just looking for a psychological crutch to get you and me through the day more easily. So is our search for meaning latching onto something that's real, or is it just a psychological crutch to get through the day?
Well, I think it certainly is a psychological crutch if what Andy has said about the meaningless of the universe is true. I think of the famous quote by Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, "Hope is in reality the worst of all evils, because it prolongs the torment of man." And it refers back to the proverb that you mentioned at the beginning, Gavin, that hope deferred makes the heart sick. If there is no ultimate meaning in the universe, if we do have to ultimately build our lives on a foundation of despair, as the famous atheist Bertrand Russell once said, and that is the mature position to take, then these ideas of hope and there being meaning and purpose and significance beyond the immediate and beyond even death itself, then in some ways it is cruel and perhaps unhelpful to give people the notion that there is something that is not there, even if it helps them. Now, of course, I think Andy's right. I think we all look for this, regardless of what we feel or see about the universe. I'm reminded of that quote by Tolstoy, who wasn't a Christian and had rejected sort of a Christian faith at his upbringing, but found himself, with all the success that he had as a 50-year-old Russian writer, asking those existential questions where he said, is there any meaning in my life that the ultimate death that awaits me cannot destroy? So Andy's right, we do have this choice really to ask ourselves, look, if there's no meaning and ultimate purpose in the universe, then maybe this is just a product of our evolutionary history to sort of help us socially or politically. But ultimately, the rational position is just to accept that everything significant, everything of achievement, everything of value will ultimately be destroyed with the death of our sun. And therefore, we might psychologically help ourselves by pretending that it's otherwise, but the reality is that it's not. And of course, the most famous person who posited that was Sigmund Freud, who suggested that the reason why people believe in God is this sort of psychological crutch. The problem with what Freud suggested was that all Freud was doing in his psychoanalysis was simply giving a reason for why people might believe in God in a universe that he had already presupposed was ultimately meaningless. So he failed in that sense to ask the antecedent question, as it were, the question that we needed to ask first. He had already presupposed that the universe was absurd and meaningless. Therefore, this is why people might believe in God, despite this being the case. But the real question is whether the universe is actually that way. Do we live in a nihilistic universe, or is it true that that actually the reason why we find ourselves searching for these things is, as Andy said, they might exist? And I think as a Christian, the reason why I am convinced that Christian hope is both true and credible and enables me to navigate the uncertainties of a vulnerable and an uncertain world is not simply because of how it helps me psychologically, or how convenient or attractive it is as an idea in and of itself, but actually it's rooted in evidence that goes way beyond how I personally feel about it at any given time. I'm sure we can get into what that evidence is later on in our discussion. But regardless of its psychological benefits, I think there's credible basis for exploring that primary question before we maybe explore why people might believe it, or indeed why it might be a psychological crutch to not believe that there's a God. That's another issue.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. I should mention that the first questions have started to come in over at Pigeonhole. So have a look again. If you want to fire some questions in for later on and be involved in the discussion, if you go to pigeonhole.at and put the code SOLAS14June in there, you can submit questions or indeed vote for some of the other questions that you can see that are in there already and join in the discussion. Thank you to those of you who have primed that and got it going. Please come and join in the conversation. Andy, I think what we need to do at this point is to maybe step back a little bit and think about a definition of hope. We've bandied the word hope around without really exploring exactly what we mean by it. Now, you're coming from a distinctly Christian position. So could you give us an idea what, as a Christian, you mean when you use the word hope? What is a Christian hope? What's unique about it? What's different about it? And what satisfies you about this definition of hope that you're using when you use that word this afternoon?
Yeah, well, again, thank you for that question, Gareth. I mean, I think Gavin, rather. I think what's interesting is I agree. I mean, I think Gareth and I have sort of set out, I think, the case that it's interesting, right? We find ourselves, particularly if you're not a Christian, living in a sort of strange paradox that you either have to pretend that there is meaning and purpose and significance in the world, or you have to just go, I've just got to just bow the knee and embrace the fact that God exists. I'm reminded of one of my philosophical heroes, C.S. Lewis. Was an atheist for the first 30 years of his life before becoming a Christian. And when finally he bowed the knee, he wrote in his diary that he was at that point the most reluctant convert in the whole of England, because he didn't want there to be a God, but realized that actually this was where the evidence was leading. But in terms of, the word hope, what is the content? I think this is so many discussions between people of all faiths and none end up often going in circularity or confusion because we don't define the words that we mean. And I think especially when it comes to a word like hope, which is the center of our discussion this afternoon, we need to sort of unpack what do we mean by that word. And so in a nutshell, I think for Christians, I want to say three things at this point, and really perhaps sow some seeds and lay some markers down that we may then return to as we go or in the Q&A. Obviously, for Christians, everything revolves around the person and identity of Jesus. We don't believe in some abstract hope that there's some sort of God out there who's a philosophical concept who can, provide things like hope and meaning and security. Christians believe in a very concrete hope that was expressed when the God who created the universe, created each one of us, and stepped into space and time and history in the person of Jesus. And so in one sense, it's almost too easy to go, yes, I believe in God and he, solves my need for hope. But actually, the God of the Bible, the God who revealed himself in Jesus, is a God who's up with his nose against the window, sort of rapping on the glass, saying, hang on, we need to have a conversation here. So I think firstly for Christians, that hope is expressed really in Jesus, his message, and particularly his dying and rising from the dead, which I think we will talk more about in a few minutes, or certainly I will if Gareth doesn't. But I think there's something unique about Christian hope in that it refers to two dimensions of time. This is something that's interested me ever since my early days as a Christian. There's a present and a future component to Christian hope. And the best way to show the differences really is to perhaps use an analogy. I often travel for work, or I did travel for work before coronavirus came along, and now I kind of walk around my garden and admire my rose bushes. But when I would travel for work, I was often on the road 100 days a year. Whenever I was away traveling, there'd be a hope I would have, and that hope would be coming home. I would look forward to coming home. Although I love being on the road and traveling and speaking, I had a hope because I wanted to come home. I had a hope of seeing my wife and my children. And that wasn't some abstract hope. That wasn't a hope that maybe one day I'll get married and maybe one day I'll have children. I have a wife. I have kids. They're a very real quality to their existence. And so I was looking forward to really discovering what that hope meant right here and now. There's a present quality to that. But also, of course, there's a future aspect to hope, and to connect that to my family, for example. I have a hope that one day I will see my children raise children of their own, that I'll become a grandfather and I can enjoy my kids make all the same mistakes in parenting that I made. And so there's a future aspect to hope. Christianity, my Christian faith, has exactly that same split, that same sort of two-sided dimension of time. There's a present reality to Christian hope and a future reality. Right now, right here, right now, in the middle of coronavirus and a world of chaos, my Christian faith is based upon, my Christian hope is based upon peace and friendship with God through what he's done for me in the person of Jesus. That gives me courage, it gives me peace, it gives me confidence and security, even when, maybe even especially when life is tough. And then there's also a future quality to Christian hope as well. I hope for justice in the future. I know that whatever happens in this realm of space and time, that even though there are some wrongs that may not be righted, they will be one day. There will be justice when God will right all wrongs. And also, as a Christian, I look forward with confidence to one day enjoying eternity of life with God. Not a kind of party in the sky when I die, but I look forward to walking and talking face to face with Jesus. One of my favorite Bible verses on the screen for you there, in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, talking about how in that age to come, God will walk with us face to face once again, wiping away every tear from our eye and being incredibly present with us, as it says elsewhere in the New Testament. Now we see as in a glass, as in a mirror, darkly, but then we will see face to face. So that really is the Christian hope for me, a present component and very much a future component as well.
So the obvious thing then, Gareth, is that people respond to that and say, peace in the present, everlasting life with God to come. That doesn't sound just too good to be true. How can somebody know that that's actually true, that it's reliable, that it's credible, and that it works? What would you say to someone who just says, well, that sounds lovely, but it's too good to be true?
Mm. I think that refers to some of the wishful thinking discussion that we were having a few moments ago, Gavin. I think we need to be careful about either dismissing something or admitting something purely on the basis of how attractive it initially is. For example, I know that many of us get spams and scams every day through our emails, promising, me that I've won £100,000 or that I'm guaranteed a new sports car if I just submit these details. Now, that's very attractive to me, but I don't put my faith in it. The reason why is because there's plenty of evidence that it's nothing more than a scam. The email address looks dodgy. I don't know anybody who's ever won any of these things. And of course, there's plenty of evidence that, there are all kinds of people out there trying to scam people. Having said that, yesterday, I received another letter in the mail saying that I was entitled and I would be receiving a certain amount of money. I'll not tell you how much it is, but this letter was from the HMRC and it was a tax rebate. Now, I could look at that and say, well, that's too good to be true as well. Let's junk that immediately. But of course, the reason why I don't is because there's evidence. I know what the HMRC is. I'm very used to paying way more tax on a monthly basis than I would certainly like to. Clearly, I've been paying too much. But also, I've had a tax rebate before, and this is the kind of time of the year that a tax rebate would make sense. So there's a cumulative case there as to why I should take this thing seriously and not, the prior emails that maybe come through. And I think it's the same with Christianity. The reason why I'm convinced that Christian hope is good and attractive is primarily because it's true. And the reason why I'm convinced that it's true is because it's based in evidence. Christianity, by definition, is an evidence-based faith, and therefore so is Christian hope. And of course, the evidence for Christian hope specifically centralizes in and around the historical figure of Jesus, and particularly in his death and resurrection. Now, it's a much bigger discussion, and there are many, many scholars way more intelligent and articulate than I am who've written pages and pages on this. But let me just mention a few things, because I think the fact that Christianity has been written into history is a very significant thing, because history in itself is testable and it's verifiable. And therefore, if the claim that Jesus Christ has come into history and people have become convinced that he is who he says he is and has done what he claimed he was going to do, certainly during his present life, then we can explore that. We can look at that. And before we get into maybe one or two pieces of evidence, I would just encourage anybody who's genuinely asking this question to simply go back to the primary evidence. That's the first place for all good research and investigation. Go to the primary sources, go to the biographical accounts of Jesus's life and ministry, and explore them for yourselves. You'd be surprised at how many people have written this stuff off before they've ever actually looked at it for themselves. And of course, some of the claims that those gospels make is that Jesus was crucified by the Romans on behalf of the Jews, but 3 days later he rose again. Now, those are historical claims that we can investigate. And in fact, just to mention a couple of scholars, there's a famous book and a famous piece of research done by two American scholars, Michael Kona and Gary Habermas, who've sort of explored what historians and sociologists and philosophers have thought and considered and written over a long period of time about the person of Jesus Christ. And they've kind of boiled it down to sort of 3 or 4 key facts that are all agreed about the experience of Jesus's death and the claims of his resurrection. And those facts are: 1, that Jesus truly died at the hands of the Romans; 2, that the tomb was empty on that Easter morning; 3, that disciples truly believed that Jesus had risen from the dead and were prepared to stake their life on it; and 4, that even some of Jesus's enemies and opponents came to believe that he'd risen from the dead. Now, if we look at that like Hercule Poirot or a murder mystery, or like somebody investigating a crime scene, we need to take all of these pieces of evidence together and ask ourselves the question: what is the best explanation for these pieces of evidence? And I think, as many people who've looked at it objectively, and some people who've even investigated it to discredit it, have come to conclude that the best explanation is that Jesus Christ truly rose from the dead. And therefore, if that's true, it means he is who he claimed to be, and he's done what he said he would do, but also we can trust that he will also do what he has promised to do in the future in terms of Christian hope. So I think there is good evidence and there's a lot to explore, but my encouragement to anybody looking at it would just be, how much have you actually explored? Let's not presuppose and write things off, or even just assume that because this is a miracle, it therefore cannot exist because the laws of gravity don't, or the laws of physics don't allow this. Let's look at this objectively and honestly and historically on its own basis and see what conclusion we come to.
Excellent. We're going to go across to our Q&A in a minute or two, just to say there's several good questions come in there. Now, if you'd like to contribute to the Q&A, there's a few minutes left before we go into that. It is still at pigeonhole.at with the access code SOLAS14June. And I see people have been voting for some of the questions as well to bring those up to the top of the list. So there's a couple more minutes that you've got the opportunity to fire questions in there. One more question for you, Andy, before we actually open up the Q&A properly. Could you just draw out for us a little bit more from one of your answers previously, please? You contrasted two elements of the Christian hope before. You put up the slide from Revelation about the Christian hope sort of in eternity, the long-term hope of eternal life with God. You also made a few references to the difference that Christian hope kind of makes in the here and now and in the everyday. I think we went through that part quite quickly. So could you give us a little bit more on what the Christian hope kind of means in the day-to-day, how it works and what effect that has on you?
Wow, there's a big question. I like that, Gavin. It's a good question, actually, because I think people sometimes from the outside looking in have this assumption that Christian faith is all about, you pray some little prayer and then you sort of get the golden ticket to heaven, like, Willy Wonka's golden ticket in the chocolate factory. And then the rest of your life, you're like, well, it makes no difference, actually. It's like a sort of life insurance policy. But actually, the thing is, as I hinted at in that last answer, I think Christian faith makes incredible difference in the present. First, I think it makes incredible difference because, as we talked about at the start, you can't actually live as if Christianity is false, which I find is interesting. Even my atheist friends have to at least assume that life has meaning and purpose, that they have significance, that life is worth living, that everything isn't absurd, that there are moral values, that justice is really justice and injustice is really unjust, and so on and so forth. There's all that piece of it. And there's been lots written on that of late, especially by atheists, actually. So Tom Holland, who's a secular historian, we've mentioned him on previous webinars, wrote a massive book last year called Dominion, tracing the impact of Christianity and saying it really is to the Christian faith that we owe our entire democratic inheritance and idea of human rights and so on and so forth. And even as an atheist, you have to at least pretend that it's true. But there are three other things that I want to say that it makes a big difference in. That's the sort of big societal piece, but there's the personal piece as well. And so there are three suggestions, three ideas I want to throw out as we bring this part of the webinar to a close. I think the first thing is that Christian faith and Christian hope in the here and now makes a big difference in terms of gratitude. That's something I've noticed over the years of being a Christian. You see, if you're not a Christian, the danger is that things like your health, your work, your bank balance, your possessions, the sports that you're into, the sexual relationships or the marriage that you have, those things become things that you desperately hold on to, either because they form your identity or because they are your hope. If you live in a world where if your job were taken away tomorrow, life is not worth living. And all of those things become things you grasp onto. And then, of course, you're afraid of losing them. And all kinds of problems follow psychologically and emotionally from that. The Christian faith allows me to say, those are all good gifts. I can give thanks to God for my job, for my health, for my marriage, for all of the incredible gifts that he's given. And those things in life become good gifts to enjoy, not things that we grasp for our identity to. And it makes an absolutely massive difference. And as a friend and former colleague of both myself and Gareth, Michael Ramsden often likes to quip. He says, the biggest problem that many people have in life is not that they have nothing to be thankful for, but they have no one to be thankful to. So gratitude is important. Secondly, there's peace. We've talked about this throughout this webinar series, actually. We live in a world where peace is in short supply. How do we find peace? How do we find confidence when all the things around us are in chaos, and logically and rationally we should be in a corner sobbing or just running out, start shouting la 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 and going mad? But Christian faith gives us incredible peace in difficult situations. And I mentioned at the start Viktor Frankl and there's others who'd been through the concentration camps and survived because of the hope that perhaps they'd had. And another of my heroes from the same period is Corrie ten Boom, who was herself imprisoned by the Nazis during the Second World War, lost a very close family member while she was interned there. But after her release, became a very famous preacher and evangelist, heading across Europe, traveling across Europe, speaking about her faith in Christ. And one of the lines she often liked to use was this one: never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. And what she's getting at there is that the future's uncertain. We don't know what's coming. Maybe tomorrow will be great, maybe it won't be. But we don't, as Christians, have to be unsure about the nature and the character and the heart of God, because that's been revealed in what God has done for us in Jesus. And that gives us tremendous security right here in the present. And then lastly, one third one to leave you with, I think Christian faith brings a real perspective on gratitude. It brings a perspective on peace. And then it brings a perspective on charity. And we live in a world in which charity is in quite short supply. Just look at what's going on in the culture wars right now, with people assuming all kinds of motives of each other. Well, one of the great things I found personally in my faith in Christ, Gavin, is being that I don't have to grasp hold of stuff. I don't need to acquire more stuff than other people. I don't need to look more morally virtuous on Twitter than other people, or score some kind of virtue signaling points in order to grasp my own identity. I don't have to do any of those things. And, we live in an age which I think is riven by what one of my friends likes to call performance-based acceptance, a culture that tells you are accepted and valued. If you look the right way, hold the right opinions, achieve the right things, then you're accepted. But along comes Christian faith and says, actually, no, it's my identity in Christ and what he's done for me that gives me my acceptance. And one more Bible verse to end this section with. One of my favorite verses in the New Testament, in 2 Corinthians, says, if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old has gone and the new is here. And that gives me a tremendous hope as a Christian right here, right now. I know what my identity is. That gives me a basis for treating others differently. That gives me peace in the present and an ability to be incredibly grateful for all that God has given, but not try to use it as the basis for my hope and my identity and my security.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Right, guys, are you up for a Q&A? We've got some, I think, some tricky questions for you.
Hey!
Are you up for it? Excellent. Okay, Gareth, can I start off with you? There's a question that's right up at the top here. And I think this one's anonymous, and I think it's obviously one that needs to be handled with a little bit of sensitivity. I don't know, Gareth, if you're up for this one. Someone's written here anonymously, I feel as if God has deserted me. Has my hope been snuffed out? Gareth.
That's a very important question, and thank you so much to whoever has had the courage to ask it. I'm sure that it resonates with many people on the live stream. I think we've all had the experience where circumstances tell us a different story than maybe we often hear in church or in the Bible, and we get mixed messages and can sometimes think that either God has abandoned us or we've done something so terrible that it's pushed God away. So it's a very, very important question. A couple of ways that I would just begin to respond with it would be to say that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. We often talk about that in terms of things that we don't know maybe about the existence of God, but it's also true about the love of God. There's a book in the New Testament called the Letter to the Romans, and in chapter 5 it talks about the love of God, and I think this sensing God's love is often what's at the heart of a question like this. We often don't feel loved by God, and it's interesting to me that when the Apostle Paul talked about the love of God in Romans 5, he talks about it in two ways. He talks about the love of God being poured into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, which in a sense is a sort of subjective sense of God's love. But also then a few verses later, he also says that God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were still in our sins, still rejecting God, Christ died for us. And in a sense, that's the objective evidence for the love of God. So our experience of the love of God is twofold. It's subjective in terms of how we feel, but it's not ultimately determined by how we feel or understand it at any given moment. the objective evidence that God has loved us and does continue to love us is that he sent Christ into the world on our behalf, and that Christ went to the cross and died and rose again. Now, that's not to say that our subjective experience of God's love is unimportant. It's very, very important. And I think, if I can say it this way, I think Christian experience, and indeed the New Testament itself, deeply resonates with this kind of experience. I did, when I did a master's at the University of Oxford, I did my thesis on the book of 1 Peter. And I think this is very, very much connected with that, because I think what the author is writing into there is an experience of people who are suffering, who are going through difficulty, not just and exploring not just the way it affects them physically, but exploring the way it affects them in terms of their confidence that Christianity is true and that God loves them. The first commandment, the first encouragement in that letter is to set your hope fully on the grace that will be yours at the revelation of Jesus. And you don't need to tell someone to set their hope unless the experience that they're having is destabilizing their hope. And Christians aren't immune from that. And so my encouragement, and there's different sort of ways to go about this. There's theological approaches, there's pastoral approaches. I think the Bible honors those different dimensions very, very well. But from the theological perspective, my encouragement is even though you may be in the dark about how you feel or sense God feels about you at any given moment, try to, if you can, nourish yourself in some of those more objective promises. And then secondly, find ways to be encouraged, be supported, be listened to, be helped to navigate through some of these questions and these experiences with Christian leaders and other people who can come alongside you and listen and support, maybe counseling and things like that. All of that's important, and it all comes together, I think, in helping us navigate these questions. But this is a far more important and a far deeper issue than I can respond to in 2 or 3 minutes. But thank you so much for asking the question, and I hope that the little that I have said has at least given you some places to go as you go on this journey.
Okay, thank you, Gareth, for that. Andy, I think someone is here picking up on something that you talked about, a distinctly Christian definition of hope in one of your earlier answers. Someone said here, is there hope for people who aren't religious? Interesting phrasing, but what do you make of that question in response to your definition of Christian hope? Is there hope for people who aren't religious?
Yeah, well, thank you for whoever asked that question. And boy, just like the question that Gareth kind of landed on, all these things, we could easily have a kind of sort of 15 or 20 minute kind of conversation, because there's a couple of things I think are fascinating built into there. Firstly, there's the question about, where hope is located, and we've touched a bit on that, but there's also the whole religious piece. But let me start with the former. If you are somebody who doesn't believe in God, if you are an atheist or agnostic, would consider yourself secular, I think you do really have to take a very honest look at what the implications are of that. There's a very important reason that Gareth particularly, and also myself, we quoted or alluded to both secular and atheist writers on this. And one of the things I've respected throughout the years is there's a strand of very honest atheist writers willing to say, if there is no God, we have a real problem. Gareth quoted Nietzsche and various others, and John Gray is one of my favorite kind of writers, who's a British atheist, and very, very honest that life is bleak, absolutely bleak. Or Lawrence M. Krauss, who's an atheist cosmologist, who famously said, human beings are a 1% bit of pollution in the universe. And if listening to this, you can't live with that, if you are somebody who's secular or agnostic or atheist, like, well, I'm not sure I believe that or I can affirm that, well, I'd say absolutely, because I don't think it's true, but I do think it's the logical outworking. So on the one sense, yeah, if you don't believe in God, and if you're right, if we live in a godless universe, then there is no hope. One day you will die, one day your descendants will die, one day the sun will expand and swallow the earth, one day everything will come to an end. And that's it. Doesn't matter what choices you make now, the outcome is the same. And that's caused many atheists, I think, sleepless nights processing that one through. So yeah, in that sense, there is no hope. On the other hand, what if there is a God and you're somebody who goes, well, I'm interested by some of what you said, some of what you've said about Jesus sounds intriguing, but I'm not a religious person. I meet many people like that who say, look, I'm quite drawn to the idea of God, the idea of Jesus attracts me, but it's organized religion I don't like. I'm often tempted to say, well, if we're going to have religion, probably better organized than disorganized, but maybe that's a cheap shot. I always want to point people then back to Jesus, because what I find fascinating, and again, I think we may have said this on a previous webinar for those who've been tracking with this, I am consistently intrigued by how irreligious Jesus himself was. He was the least religious of any founder of any religion you can possibly imagine. If you read the Gospels, those 4 historical biographies about him that Gareth mentioned earlier, what's intriguing, he spends most of his time gunning for and criticizing and going after the religious authorities, particularly the Pharisees, who were the kind of ultra moral religious types of their day. They believed in following God's laws to the letter and wanted everybody else to know that they were. Oh, Jesus didn't go and hang out with those guys who were the religious superstars. He went and hung out with those who consider themselves not religious, those who thought actually, God wasn't for them, those who thought their lives were so bad or were so unreligious. What could the God of the universe possibly want with them? And Jesus consistently sought them out. And I think what Jesus is interested in the way he deals with each one of us, I think he's not particularly interested in religion, because religion just lets you show off. You can claim all this, you can say, look at all the theology I know. Look at all the moral commandments I'm keeping. Look at what a wonderful life I'm living. I think what Jesus is most interested by is somebody who's willing to say, look, I know I'm not special. I know that actually I've failed in a number of ways. I know that actually I need help and I need rescue. I know that I can't get to some kind of vision of hope on my own, but I need help from outside. Jesus, would you please help me? And in one sense, being quote unquote not religious is perhaps a helpful starting point, because then maybe you can read the Gospels like Gareth encouraged you to do and actually try and approach Jesus on his own terms, rather than fit him into some half-remembered Christian faith that perhaps you experienced from singing a few hymns at school years ago. But actually take a look at who Jesus is, because he has plenty of room for repentant, unreligious people. And actually, there's hope for those of us who are religious too, because Jesus had time for religious people who are willing to go, look, I'm sorry, I've been a bit proud and a bit holier than thou. I want to turn around and approach you properly, Jesus.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. All right, time is really starting to move through. Let's do another question. Okay, Gareth, this one for you then. Quite a long question, but bear with it for a second. Christians express hope as if it was a tangible good that we can import into our lives. I think that if there is a God, he's left us to make our own hope. So why is your answer better than mine? Gareth, have a chew on that for a second.
Well, I think this question of hope being a tangible good, I think hope by definition is something that is not immediate and tangible, and therefore it exists in the future. It's something that we constantly look towards. Hope realized isn't hope in that sense. So in that sense, there's always an element in which hope isn't tangible, and that includes Christian hope. But that is not to say that the basis for why we trust that hope is true is not tangibly available in the past, and that hope, having that hope, doesn't tangibly work out in the present. So we've touched on some of the evidence of that. I think, yes, hope in a sense is not realized, and therefore in that sense it's not tangible. But at the same time, Christian hope is tangibly accessible in terms of the evidence, certainly historically, for it. And therefore, there's a basis for it. But also, as Andy has mentioned just before we got into the Q&A, it's also tangible in terms of the difference that it makes to our lives. Now, of course, that's not the only evidence that Christianity and Christian hope is true, but it's certainly, because, of course, Christianity claims to make changes. It really does claim to turn people's lives completely around, make them new, as Andy has already quoted. And that kind of evidence is tangible to investigate.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I don't, I'm uncomfortable with this question of better, because I think that often is a value-laden term, and it talks about, oh, you're better than me because you believe this. I want to distance myself, very socially distance myself from that kind of idea. But I do want us to, that doesn't mean that even though all people are equal, that all ideas are equal. And we need to make that distinction. And we're losing the ability to do it, I think, a lot in our current social climate and ideological climate. But the real question is not that we're anybody's better individually, but when we look at the evidence for ultimate reality and for the hope that we place, either what we create for ourselves or what Christianity says exists beyond ourselves because of the person of Jesus, what is the best evidence? And as we look at it as objectively as possible, which set of evidence makes the most sense, is most coherent, and therefore leads us to say this looks like it's true. So those are the things that I think we need to look at rather than make evaluations of each other based on what we believe. I think there's good precedent in the Bible for not doing that, as much as there is precedent for engaging with ideas and exploring the evidence and seeing where it goes. And just very quickly, the final thing to say is that that's not to say that our holding on to hope or our realizing that this is true is easy. I think the last question that I answered does really does identify that. I'm assuming that the person, because they said they felt that God had abandoned them, that they believe in God, and it's very possible for us to lose confidence at times in our hope because of our experience. And I think again, the Bible takes that very seriously. The disciples didn't easily come to the conclusion that Jesus had risen from the dead. There were huge obstacles, but there's an amazing story in Luke chapter 24 where Jesus comes alongside two individuals who've had their hope in Jesus as Messiah completely dashed because they saw him crucified. And I think that's it. Let's just go home. And what's interesting is that Jesus in that story goes along a journey with them. And it's a journey, yes, physically, but it's also a journey of their disillusionment and their questions. And he's prepared to engage carefully and yet very precisely, right to the point where they realize actually this is true. So, there's we're not going outside of the Bible in terms of inviting people to explore their questions. This is exactly what the Bible says Christians, and in fact, Jesus did himself.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting thing. What was that you said in the middle there? All people are equal, but
all ideas are not necessarily equal.
Well, not all ideas. That was very helpful. I appreciated that. While you were speaking, there's been some voting and the questions have been moving around. So Andy, the one that's now been voted up to the top while Gareth was speaking, there comes from Ron. And I think he's picking up on something that you spoke about earlier on in this webinar. Ron says, what if everything is ultimately absurd? Why bother looking for a hope you might never find instead of just enjoying today? Sounds like those atheist bus adverts that were around a few years ago, doesn't it? It's reminiscent of that. So what if it is all absurd? Why bother looking for a hope you might never find instead of just enjoying today? Andy?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for that, Ron. And actually, you're absolutely right, Gavin. That is reminiscent of a few years ago. Some viewers may remember there was the Atheist Bus campaign, where a group of atheists clubbed together and on adverts on the side of buses in London, but also where I was living actually in Canada at the time. These buses trundling around Toronto with the sign with an advert on the side saying there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. Whole number of problems with that, and it was interesting that many atheist philosophers actually had a real go at those buses for a whole number of reasons, not least perhaps the word probably. I'd like to, if I had a coffee with Richard Dawkins, I'd like to go, well, that's an interesting admission, Richard, that you're not certain, just probable. But the big issue with, and it's a slight issue behind the way that Ron's phrased that question, to collapse the whole of life to just enjoyment is somewhat problematic. The whole range of human experience is vast. As human beings, we're wired for love and commitment and joy and hope and sorrow and despair and happiness. The list goes on, a veritable A to Z of emotions. In fact, in my last book, The Atheist Didn't Exist, as a laugh, actually, I did try and list every human emotion I could think of and get through A to Z. I got through every single one of them, but couldn't come up with one for X. I thought xenophobia was probably not a good one. Blame the French for that. And but my point being is to reduce the whole of existence to just enjoyment seems to be a little bit narrow. It's also rather sort of, I hate to sort of say this because I'm not sure where Ron is coming from geographically, but it does seem a rather sort of privileged Western position to say, well, my life's okay. You know, I'm great. I've got, you know, I haven't lost my job through to coronavirus. I haven't been laid off. I've done quite well on the stock market. I've paid off my mortgage. So life is pretty good, actually. I can enjoy myself. But hang on, and what if you're one of the majority of human beings whose life is not going so well? What if you're one of the billions of people who live on less than $5 a day and are struggling to make ends meet? What if you've just lost loved ones to coronavirus or HIV and AIDS, or you know, to some sort of massacre between warring tribes in one of the war-torn parts of the world? What if life doesn't look like enjoyment? What if life doesn't smell like roses? Rather, it smells more like an encounter between a sewage farm and a wind turbine. Then it looks a bit problematic. So that's a massive issue with it too. But also, I think underpinning it, Ron, for me, would be the question of it doesn't answer the question of whether it's true. And Gareth posed this, and right in one of the earlier things that he said, where he talked about Freud and this tendency to try and, for some in the more skeptical end of the discussion, to explain everything away in terms of psychology, and going, but it doesn't answer the question whether it's true. You see, to me, what's always interested me, and I've had so many fruitful conversations with atheists and secular agnostic friends around this, if as human beings we are wired to look for hope, we are wired to look for purpose, that we can't actually get through life realistically just partying day after day. We need more than just food and sex. That explains the whole of the literary canon, why we're into music and art and all kinds of other things. If we are wired in such a way that we can't live without significant hope and meaning and purpose, you are back to that paradox of going, what on earth was evolution doing when it threw up creatures as bizarre as us, with the effort and energy we spend pursuing meaning and spirituality and justice and beauty and truth and so on, when they aren't to be found? Or is it more likely, is the balance of probabilities more likely that the reason we are wired to pursue those things is they're designed to meet their fulfillment in the God who made us? And as the famous church historian and philosopher Augustine, 1700 years ago, once famously said, he said, you know, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God, in that restlessness, that desire for these things actually does point somewhere. And yeah, we can stick our heads in the sand and pretend not to pursue that question. But I would say every day life shouts at us that actually that reality isn't true. And so that's why I think it's worth taking a very serious look at Jesus. And I respect you, Ron, if you take a very strong look and properly investigate the evidence and decide, look, I don't think the evidence is true. I have less time for people who are like, well, you know, it might not be true, therefore I'm not going to look. Given how much hangs on this, I think it's worth taking the investigation, the pursuit properly. And as Jesus said, those who seek will find.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Andy. We're kind of almost out of time. I've got room for, I think, one last question. I want to pop this one to Gareth. Gareth, you mentioned some books earlier, and someone's just put the question, what evidence? Question mark. You made a reference earlier on at the beginning to, was it a Michael Licona book? Could you give us that reference again, and maybe some other places where you would suggest people have a read if they want to explore some of the evidence that you referred to earlier on in the webinar? Maybe some stuff on origins, maybe some stuff on Jesus. Where would you recommend someone who says, okay, what evidence? Where should they start if they wanted to read something further?
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. It's a really great question. Let me just mention a few of the things that have been helpful for me individually, and then maybe Andy will talk about some that have been helpful for him. But for me personally, I've talked a lot about the historical Jesus, and there's a really helpful book that I've identified quite recently, written by a historian in Australia called John Dixon, who's written a very short book called Is Jesus History? And it's really just looking at the historical evidence that there is for him as a scholar, and that other scholars, whether Christian or atheist or of other ideologies, they've come and they've looked at this as an intellectual discipline and explored the evidence for it. And there's a little chapter at the end of that goes to this question of the resurrection. The book by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, I'm trying to remember the name of it off the top of my head. I think it's The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus.
Okay. Yes, Andy says yes, it is. You got a
thumbs up. My memory's working okay.
Thank you.
There's a couple of others. One other that I'll just mention. There's a huge volume by N.T. Wright. So if you'd like 800 pages to read on the resurrection of Jesus, read the one by N.T. Wright. But one that I personally find very helpful, because it's also actually written not just as sort of facts and abstract ideas, but it's written as somebody's personal journey. But it's also very helpful in terms of the ideas. Is a book by my late friend Nabil Qureshi called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And if he had encounters with Gary Habermas and Mike Lacuna on his personal journey, he was a Muslim doctor and began to explore and engage with Christians and debate them, and again began to explore some of the evidence, and eventually the evidence for the resurrection was deeply persuasive for him. It's a fantastic book, very, very readable, short chapters, a really engaging story, but a lot of great content in there as well. And obviously there's the classics, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel and things like that as well.
Yeah. Good stuff. We are out of time. There's just kind of things to finish with. Thank you, David, for your quote that you put in Pigeonhole. It wasn't a question. If you want to read a helpful quote about what God can teach us through times of doubt, go to Pigeonhole, read David's quote from Dallas Willard. I appreciate that. It wasn't a question, but it was a helpful quote. Andy, can you just finish up for us then by suggesting, if someone's watching this webinar this afternoon and they think this is really interesting, they want to know more, they want to take things a bit further, where would you recommend, maybe online, that people could have a look to explore some of these issues further about the quest for hope?
Yeah, thank you for that. As we draw this study to a close, Gavin, I want to recommend three things really, depending on where you're at. We're very conscious as a mixed audience, has been reflected in the questions. So maybe there are some of you listening to this who have real questions that you want to see answered. Maybe some of what Gareth has said about evidence has really intrigued you. Maybe you've got a particular objection or some aspect of the Christian faith you're really not sure about. And so I want to recommend, and it starts initially, something for you folks. And that would be on the Solas website. We have this wonderful resource called Short Answers. And these are a collection now of about 72, I think, videos that myself and others have filmed, where we take a common question, a common objection to Christian faith, and we try and explore it in 3 to 4 minutes. We can only go so far, but it's a great starting point. And actually, if you look on the screen share there that I'm showing, up at the top right-hand corner, you'll see a very young-looking Gareth Black, actually, back in the days when it looks like he was just 13 in that picture, actually. But Gareth recorded some for us, so that's a great jumping off point, because
it looked like that before I worked with you, Andy.
Yes, look what working with us has done. But maybe you've got real questions and you want to get them addressed. Well, the Short Answers resource is brilliant for you. I would highly recommend that. Maybe there are others of you on this webinar who are thinking, you know what, I actually want to explore some of this more carefully and more thoroughly, maybe in community with others. I've enjoyed the webinar. Maybe a friend invited you to watch this, or you kind of stumbled across us on Facebook or YouTube or wherever, and you want to go deeper and just begin thinking these things through. And I hugely encourage you to do that. I would never encourage anyone to just leap into following Christ without really thinking it through. Jesus encouraged people to count the cost of faith. And therefore, 2 resources I want to mention here that can be really helpful. Our friends at Christianity Explored and our friends at Alpha. Both are very similar. There are some differences, but a similar approach where they put people together into small groups and let you really just take time to think through and journey through and discover the claims of Jesus. And they do that in community. These days, they're doing it online and doing virtual versions where you can meet up with others and you can ask questions, you can discuss, and you can chat. And millions of people actually have found both Christianity Explored and Alpha have been instrumental in helping them investigate and then put their trust in the claims of Christ. So hugely recommend both Christianity Explored and Alpha. But then lastly, there may be people watching this call watching this webinar who, you've thought about these things before. Maybe you've read one of the books that Gareth recommended. Maybe you watched some videos. Maybe you've done an Alpha course. And really, deep down that you're sitting on the fence and you need to do something about it. It's easy to sort of think about these things in the abstract. But as I said earlier, the God of the Bible is a God who's got his nose up to the window and sort of tapping on the glass, wanting our attention, especially when he stepped into history in the person of Jesus. And the question Jesus asks of each one of us is, who do you say I am? And how are you going to respond? And some of you perhaps watching this know that you actually have to take that step. And again, that's harder in a world where many of us are in lockdown. It's not so easy to perhaps walk into a church or meet up with a Christian friend. But on our website, we filmed, as part of the Short Answer series a few weeks ago, a video called How Do I Become a Christian? And the URL is there for you. It's our 70th kind of short answer. Just encourage you to have a watch of that, and it will just chat through and teach you a very simple little 4-word prayer that you can use, whether you've someone who's prayed before, whether you have no idea how prayer works. And I'll just walk you through how you can become a follower of Jesus. And perhaps some of you watching this know that that's a step you need to take. And if you take that step, do reach out to us on social media. We'd love to connect you with other Christians. We have sort of friends and connections across the country and around the world. We can probably connect you with somebody. And equally, if you've got a burning question that is really the stumbling block holding you back from faith and putting your trust in Jesus, reach out to myself or to Gavin or to Gareth. We would love, it would be our privilege to kind of help you on that journey towards discovering who Jesus is.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. Our time has gone. We have slightly overrun. Sorry about that. You can watch this again. If there was a reference or a book or a quote or something you want to pick up on, rewind. You can watch this all again on our social media channels. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Hope you found it stimulating, challenging, exciting, and that you'll find a way to respond to everything that's been said. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for voting at Pigeonhole. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Andy, again for your time, your wit and wisdom this afternoon. We appreciated that. And we will see you again soon. Anything you want to know about any of this, come over to our website, solas-cpc.org. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.